The evolution of Southern rock, the 1970s. The highway stretches ahead into the darkness, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through the warm southern night. The radio is on, tuned to an FM station out of Atlanta or Jacksonville or some smaller city in between, and the signal fades in and out as the miles pass, static mixing with guitars and drums and voices singing about roads and freedom and the particular weight of belonging to this place, this region, this contested and complicated South. It is sometime past midnight, probably, though the exact hour doesn't matter much out here, where the landscape is measured in distance rather than time. The headlights illuminate pine trees lining the roadside, their trunks dark against darker forest. Occasionally a town appears, gas stations with their fluorescent islands of light, a diner still open with a few trucks parked outside, the glow of neon signs advertising beer and rooms and food. Then the town falls behind, and the darkness returns, the forest pressing close on both sides, the road running straight and endless. The music on the radio is Southern rock, though the people listening might not use that term or any term. It is simply the music that sounds like where they are, the sound of guitars that know how to bend notes, the way a voice bends when it's singing the blues, the sound of drums that swing hard without rushing, the sound of voices that carry the accent and the phrasing and the particular emotional grain of the region. This is where we begin tonight, on this highway, in this darkness, with this music playing through tinny speakers, in a car moving through the southern night. Because Southern rock in the 1970s was not just a genre or a collection of songs. It was a landscape, a feeling, a way of being in a specific place at a specific time. It was the sound of a region hearing itself, reckoning with its past, trying to imagine its future. The story we will tell across the hours ahead is a slow one, moving at the pace of a long drive rather than a quick arrival. We will stop in towns where bands were formed, in studios where albums were recorded, in bars and arenas where the music was played live and transformed in the playing. We will listen to guitars and organs and drums, to the voices singing and the crowds responding, to the particular texture of this music as it existed in its time and place. Settle in. The night is long, the road ahead is measured in hours, and there is no hurry. The music will be there when we arrive, patient and familiar, waiting to be heard again as it was heard then. Through the warm southern darkness, carried on air that smells of pine and dust and summer heat, echoing in spaces where people gathered to hear their own lives reflected back to them in amplified sound. The Southern Night, an opening meditation. Before we trace the history and the bands and the specific developments that created Southern rock in the 1970s, let us spend time simply inhabiting the atmosphere where this music lived. Because Southern rock was inseparable from the sensory environment of the American South, from the heat and the humidity, from the landscape and the light, from the particular quality of night as it settles over small towns and rural roads. The South in the 1970s was a region in transition, caught between a past that was recent enough to be remembered in intimate detail and a future that was unclear and contested. The civil rights movement had challenged and partially dismantled the legal structures of segregation, but the social and cultural realities of the region were still being renegotiated, still being worked out in daily life and in the larger questions of identity and belonging. For young white Southerners coming of age in this moment, The question of what it meant to be Southern was particularly complex. The region's history included much that was difficult to celebrate: slavery, segregation, violence, poverty. But it also included things that felt true and valuable: family ties, musical traditions, a connection to specific places and landscapes, ways of speaking and being that were distinct from the rest of the country. Southern rock emerged in this context as one answer to the question of Southern identity. It was music that took pride in being from the South, while not necessarily defending everything the South had been or done. It drew on Black musical traditions, the blues most prominently, but also gospel and soul, while being played primarily by white musicians for primarily white audiences. It claimed authenticity through its connection to place and tradition, while also being electric, loud, modern, aligned with the long-haired youth culture that was changing America in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The music itself carried these tensions and complexities in its sound. The blues scales and phrasings that ran through Southern rock came directly from African American musical traditions, from the Delta blues and the urban blues of cities like Memphis and Chicago. The slide guitar techniques that became characteristic of the genre echoed both gospel steel guitar and the bottleneck blues playing of rural Mississippi. The call and response patterns between guitars, the way rhythm and lead instruments would converse within a song, reflected Black musical aesthetics. But Southern rock also incorporated country music traditions, the storytelling, the focus on everyday life and work, the honky-tonk piano, and the twang of certain vocal deliveries. It incorporated the amplified intensity of rock and roll, the volume and the distortion, and the emphasis on live performance energy. And it incorporated a jam band sensibility, an improvisational approach that treated songs as frameworks for extended exploration, rather than as fixed compositions to be reproduced exactly each time. The landscape itself was part of the music's identity. The South of the 1970s was still heavily rural in many areas, still defined by small towns connected by two-lane highways, by farmland and forest, by rivers and Piedmont and coastal plains. The cities, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Birmingham, Memphis, New Orleans, were growing and changing, but much of the region's cultural life still happened in smaller places, in communities where everyone knew each other, where music was played in local bars and VFW halls and high school gymnasiums. The climate shaped the experience of this music in fundamental ways. The South is hot for much of the year, humid and thick with moisture, and this heat affects everything: how people move, how they dress, how they gather. Summer nights in the South are events unto themselves. The air remains warm long after sunset. The humidity creates a weight and a closeness. The insects sing their constant electric chorus. The sky stays light in the west until late evening, and then darkens to purple, and finally to black Mars. Outdoor concerts in the South happened in this atmosphere. A stage would be set up in a field or a fairground, amplifiers stacked on either side, lights rigged overhead. As the sun went down and the temperature dropped from oppressive to merely warm, people would gather, arriving in pickup trucks and vans, bringing coolers of beer, spreading out across the grass or the dirt, claiming their territory for the night. The music would start as dusk settled, and it would continue for hours, the guitars and drums carrying across the open space, the lights washing the stage in colours that shifted with each song. The indoor venues had their own atmosphere. Southern roadhouses and bars in the 1970s were particular kinds of spaces: low ceilings and wooden floors, neon beer signs and cigarette smoke thick enough to see in layers under the lights, pool tables in the back, and a small stage or cleared area at the front where bands set up their equipment. The PA systems were often minimal, which meant the music came primarily from the amplifiers themselves: guitar amps turned up loud, organs running through Leslie's, drums hit hard to cut through the volume. Progressed. The bands would play long progressed. The bands would play long sets, 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours of music with short breaks, and by the end of the night, everyone was drenched in sweat, the atmosphere dense and primal, the music creating a shared physical experience that was as much about endurance and communion as about entertainment. The highways connected these venues, creating circuits that bands traveled repeatedly, from Macon to Jacksonville to Atlanta to Birmingham and back, from college town to college town, from outdoor festival to indoor club. The experience of being in a van on these highways at night, equipment loaded in back, the next gig a few hours away, became part of the mythology and the reality of Southern rock. The landscape passing in darkness, the radio picking up different stations as you moved through regions, the occasional stop at an all-night diner or gas station, fluorescent and stark against the surrounding dark. This was the environment that produced and sustained Southern rock. Warm nights and long highways, outdoor fields and indoor bars, the particular social landscape of the South in a moment of transition, the musical traditions of both black and white Southerners available to be drawn upon and combined in new ways. The music that emerged from this environment sounded like where it came from: humid and extended, bluesy and twangy, electric but rooted, modern but traditional, loud but swinging. Roots and rivers, the musical traditions that fed Southern rock. To understand Southern rock, we must understand the musical traditions it drew from, the deep roots that fed the specific flowering that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These traditions were old and interwoven, coming from both the black and white communities of the South, from rural and urban contexts, from sacred and secular practices. The blues was the most direct and obvious influence. The blues had been born in the South, in the cotton fields and the lumber camps and the small towns of the Delta, expressing the experiences of Black Americans through a musical language that was at once simple in structure and infinitely deep in feeling. The 12-bar blues form, the blues scale with its flattened thirds and sevenths and sometimes fifths, the call and response patterns, the techniques of bending strings and sliding between notes, all of this became fundamental to Southern rock. But the blues that influenced Southern rock was not just the acoustic country blues of the early 20th century. It was also the electric blues that had developed in Memphis and Chicago in the 1940s and 1950s, the amplified and urbanized blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King. This was blues played through amplifiers with electric guitars and bass and drums, creating a heavier, more powerful sound than acoustic instruments could produce. The guitar playing of Southern rock drew directly from blues traditions, the use of pentatonic scales, the emphasis on bending strings to create vocal-like expressiveness, the technique of playing slide guitar with a glass or metal tube. All of these came from the blues. The rhythmic approach, the way guitars could both drive the beat and play against it, creating tension and swing. This too came from blues practice. But Southern rock guitarists also learned from rock and roll pioneers, from Chuck Berry's rhythmic attack and lyrical soloing, from the British blues revival bands like the Rolling Stones and Cream and the Yardbirds, who had taken American blues and amplified it further, adding distortion and volume and extended improvisation. The twin guitar approach that became characteristic of Southern rock, two lead guitarists playing off each other, harmonizing and trading solos and creating intricate interplay, drew on these rock influences while maintaining blues feel at the core. Gospel music was another essential influence, though one that is sometimes less acknowledged. The gospel traditions of the Black church, the harmonies, the emotional intensity, the call and response between preacher and congregation, or between lead vocalist and choir, shaped the way Southern rock vocalists sang and the way bands structured their songs. The Hammond organ, which became a signature sound in Southern rock, came directly from Black church practice, where the organ was central to gospel worship. The slide guitar techniques that became so important in Southern rock had roots in both blues and gospel. The sacred steel guitar tradition, playing lap steel or pedal steel guitar in Pentecostal and holiness churches, involved the same kinds of singing, swooping tones that Southern rock slide guitarists would employ. The emotional vocabulary of gospel, the way a note could be bent or sustained to express longing or joy or sorrow, transferred directly into secular contexts. Country music traditions also fed into Southern rock, particularly the honky-tonk sound of the 1940s and 1950s. The emphasis on storytelling, on songs about everyday life and work and travel, on simple, direct language. This came from country. The twang of certain vocal deliveries, the use of pedal steel guitar in some Southern rock bands, the occasional acoustic guitar or fiddle, these were country elements incorporated into the electric rock sound. The boogie-woogie piano tradition, which had roots in both blues and country contexts, contributed to the rhythmic drive of much Southern rock. Piano players in Southern rock bands often played in a barrel house or honky-tonk style, with strong left-hand bass patterns and rhythmic right-hand figures that pushed the beat forward. This piano sound connected to both the juke joints of the rural South and the roadhouses where country music was played. All of these traditions, blues, gospel, country, rock and roll, were available to young Southern musicians in the late 1960s. They had grown up hearing this music, sometimes directly in their communities, sometimes through radio and records, and importantly, these traditions were not separate or pure. They had been influencing each other for generations, creating a rich musical ecology where boundaries between genres were porous and artists freely borrowed from whatever sources spoke to them. The specific innovation of Southern rock was in how these elements were combined and amplified, how they were adapted to the context of electric rock bands playing for young audiences in the early 1970s. The music took the improvisational intensity of blues and extended it into long jams. It took the emotional directness of gospel and applied it to secular themes of freedom and belonging. It took the storytelling of country and set it to heavy electric guitars and drums. It took the energy of rock and roll and grounded it in distinctly Southern musical gestures and references. The result was a sound that felt both modern and traditional, both rebellious and rooted. It was music that could be played loud in arenas, but that never lost touch with the quieter, older musical practices it drew from. It was music made by white Southerners that was unimaginable without the black musical traditions of the region. It was, in all these ways, a music of synthesis and tension, of multiple influences held together in a recognizable but unstable form. Macon, Georgia, the Capricorn Sound, and the Allman Brothers. If Southern rock had a capital city in the early 1970s, it was Macon, Georgia. This middle-sized city in central Georgia, situated on the Ocmulgee River about 80 miles southeast of Atlanta, became the headquarters of Capricorn Records and the home base of the Allman Brothers Band, and in those roles it functioned as the center of gravity for much of what Southern rock would become. Macon in the early 1970s was not an obvious music industry town. It was a regional center with a history dating back to the early 19th century, a place that had grown around river trade and later around railroads and then around military bases and manufacturing. It had a black community and a white community, largely separate, each with their own churches and schools and social institutions. It had the layered history of the South, antebellum grandeur and Civil War trauma, and Jim Crow segregation and civil rights struggle. But Macon also had a musical heritage. Little Richard had been born there, and Otis Redding had recorded there at the Stax Studio before his death in 1967. The city had clubs and venues where music was played, and it had people who understood the business of making and selling records. When Phil Walden, a music manager and promoter who had worked with Otis Redding, decided to start a record label in the late 1960s, he chose to base it in Macon rather than moving to Nashville or Los Angeles or New York. Capricorn Records, founded in 1969, was intended from the beginning to be a Southern label, recording Southern artists and maintaining a Southern identity. Walden believed that there was a market for music that sounded distinctly Southern, that drew on the region's musical traditions and spoke to its contemporary experiences. The Allman Brothers Band became the label's first and most important signing, and their success would prove Walden's instincts correct. The Allman Brothers Band had formed in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1969, but they relocated to Macon to be near Capricorn and to have a base for their operations. The band consisted of Duane Allman and Dickie Betts on guitars, Greg Allman on organ and vocals, Berry Oakley on bass, and Butch Trucks and Jamo Johansson on drums. This lineup, 2 lead guitarists, 2 drummers, organ, bass, and vocals, created a sound that was rich and layered, capable of both delicate dynamics and overwhelming power. Duane Allman was already known as a session guitarist, having played on records by Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin at the Muscle Shoals studio in Alabama. His slide guitar playing was extraordinary, capable of expressing an almost vocal quality of emotion, bending and sustaining notes with perfect pitch and timing. Dickie Betts brought a more melodic, jazz-influenced approach to the guitar, and the interplay between his playing and Duane's became one of the band's defining characteristics. The 2 drummers, Trucks and Jamo, created a rhythmic foundation that was simultaneously solid and fluid. They did not simply keep time in the way that a single drummer might. They created rhythmic dialogues, layering different patterns, moving between straight and swinging feels, pushing and pulling the tempo in ways that gave the music a breathing quality. Jamo, who was black and had a jazz background, brought sophistication and subtlety to the drumming that elevated it beyond simple rock backbeats. Greg Allman's organ playing filled the harmonic space between the guitars and the rhythm section, creating dense chords and swirling textures that could support the guitars or emerge into the foreground during his own solos. His voice was distinctive, rough and soulful, capable of conveying both vulnerability and strength, singing with a phrasing that came from blues and soul traditions. The music the Allman Brothers made in their early years was blues-based but expansive. Songs would start with a clear melodic theme, often built around a blues progression or a variation on blues changes, and then the band would explore that theme through extended improvisation. The solos were not simply displays of technical facility, though the playing was certainly virtuosic, but rather explorations of feeling and possibility, the band listening to each other and responding, building intensity gradually, finding moments of climax and then pulling back, creating arcs of tension and release that could stretch across 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. Their first two studio albums, released in 1969 and 1970, established their approach and their sound, but it was their live performances that really captured what the band could do. On stage, the Allman Brothers extended their songs far beyond the studio versions, treating concerts as opportunities for the kind of sustained improvisation that couldn't fit on a vinyl record. A song like Whipping Post, which was about 7 minutes on the studio album, might stretch to 20 or 25 minutes in concert, with multiple extended solos and dynamic shifts. The band toured relentlessly in 1970 and 1971, playing colleges and clubs and outdoor venues across the South and increasingly across the rest of the country as their reputation spread. They developed a devoted following among audiences who appreciated their musicianship and their willingness to take risks in performance, to not simply reproduce their records, but to use songs as starting points for exploration. In March 1971, the Allman Brothers recorded a series of concerts at the Fillmore East in New York City, and these performances were released as a double album later that year. At Fillmore East captured the band at the peak of their powers, playing with intensity and precision and joy, the improvisations coherent and purposeful, the ensemble playing tight even as individual musicians stretched out into solos. The album was both a commercial success and an artistic statement, demonstrating that Southern rock could be virtuosic and sophisticated while maintaining its roots in blues feeling and Southern identity. The success of At Fillmore East brought the Allman Brothers national recognition and positioned them as leaders of the emerging Southern rock movement, but the triumph was brief. In October 1971, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident in Macon. He was 24 years old, at the height of his creative powers, and his death was a devastating loss for the band and for the music. The band continued after Duane's death, completing the album they had been working on, Eat a Peach, which combined studio tracks from before Duane's accident with live recordings, and eventually recruiting a new guitarist, Chuck Leavell, and continuing to tour and record. But the loss of Duane fundamentally changed the band's sound and trajectory. His slide guitar, his particular approach to improvisation, his leadership within the group's musical conversations, none of this could simply be replaced. The Allman Brothers' importance to Southern rock extended beyond their own music. They had demonstrated that a band from the South, playing music rooted in Southern traditions, could achieve both artistic credibility and commercial success. They had shown that blues-based improvisation could work in a rock context, that extended jams were viable, that a band could be virtuosic without losing emotional directness. And they had created in Macon a scene and a support structure the record label, the rehearsal spaces, the community of musicians and crew that other Southern rock bands could draw upon. The Capricorn label, buoyed by the Allman Brothers' success, signed and developed other Southern rock acts through the early 1970s. The Marshall Tucker Band, Wet Willie, and others recorded for Capricorn, and benefited from the label's regional identity and its understanding of how to market Southern rock. Macon remained the spiritual and organizational center of the genre, even as bands were based in other Southern cities. The city itself became part of the mythology. The big house where members of the Allman Brothers Band and their extended community lived communally became a gathering place for musicians and friends, a space where the boundaries between life and art were porous, where music was played informally as well as in performance contexts. The H&H Restaurant, a soul food establishment where the band regularly ate, became part of the scene's geography, a place where musicians and fans might encounter each other over plates of fried chicken and greens. This sense of place, of music being embedded in a specific community and landscape, was important to Southern rock's identity. The genre was not just about a sound, it was about where that sound came from, about the connection between music and place, about the idea that this music could only have been made in the South by people who understood the region's history and its musical traditions and its contemporary realities. Jacksonville and beyond, Lynyrd Skynyrd and the harder edge. While Macon served as one pole of Southern rock, Jacksonville, Florida, provided another musically distinct but equally important. Jacksonville was where Lynyrd Skynyrd formed and developed, and Skynyrd's approach to Southern rock was different from the Allman Brothers in ways that expanded the genre's range and its audience. Jacksonville in the early 1970s was a port city, a working-class town with military bases and industrial operations, a place where country and soul and rock and roll all had audiences. The city's music scene was active, but not as organized or label-centered as Macon's. Bands played in local clubs and high school gymnasiums, building followings through live performance rather than through record company support. Lynyrd Skynyrd began as a group of high school friends in the mid-1960s, playing under various names before settling on Lynyrd Skynyrd, a mocking reference to a high school gym teacher who had hassled them about their long hair. The band's lineup went through changes, but by the early 1970s, it had stabilized around Ronnie Van Zant on vocals, Gary Rossington and Alan Collins on guitars, Ed King on guitar, later replaced by Steve Gaines, Leon Wilkson on bass, Billy Powell on keyboards, and Bob Burns on drums, later replaced by Artemis Pyle. Where the Allman Brothers emphasized improvisation and jazz-influenced interplay, Lynyrd Skynyrd emphasized structure and power. Their songs were tightly arranged, built around strong riffs and clear melodic hooks, designed to be anthems as much as vehicles for extended solos. The three-guitar attack, 3 electric guitars playing harmonized lines, creating a wall of sound that was both heavy and melodic, became their signature approach. Ronnie Van Zant was a different kind of frontman than Greg Allman. Where Greg's voice was soulful and vulnerable, Ronnie's was aggressive and confident, singing with a pronounced Southern accent and a confrontational edge. His lyrics addressed Southern identity directly, often defensively, asserting pride in being from the South while acknowledging the region's complexities and contradictions. The song Sweet Home Alabama, released in 1974, became Lynyrd Skynyrd's biggest hit and one of the most recognizable Southern rock anthems. written in response to Neil Young's songs Southern Man and Alabama, which criticized the South for its history of racism. Sweet Home Alabama was both a celebration of the region and a complicated statement about Southern identity. The lyrics referenced George Wallace, the segregationist Alabama governor, in ways that were ambiguous. Were they endorsing him or being ironic? Listeners interpreted the song differently, and the band members themselves gave different accounts of their intentions. This ambiguity around racial politics was not unique to Lynyrd Skynyrd, but it was particularly visible in their case because of their commercial success and because of how explicitly they addressed Southern identity in their lyrics. The band played Free Bird, their epic ballad-turned-guitar showcase, with an American flag backdrop, and they used Confederate flag imagery in some of their promotional materials and stage designs. The Confederate flag's meaning was contested terrain in the 1970s South. For some, it represented regional pride and rebellion against outside judgment, divorced from its historical association with slavery and segregation. For others, it remained an unmistakable symbol of white supremacy and resistance to civil rights. Southern rock bands' use of the flag was part of this contested space, claiming Southernness in ways that were fraught with historical weight. But Lynyrd Skynyrd's music also had progressive elements that complicated simple political categorizations. The band spoke out against gun violence in Saturday Night Special. They criticized the entertainment industry's exploitation in working for MCA, and their shows regularly featured black musicians as opening acts or special guests, suggesting that their relationship to racial politics was more complex than their imagery might suggest. What was undeniable was the power of their music and their connection to working-class Southern audiences. Lynyrd Skynyrd's songs addressed the lives of people who worked hard for modest pay, who were proud of where they came from even if they were critical of specific policies or politicians, who wanted music that reflected their experiences without apology or condescension. Songs like Gimme 3 Steps and Simple Man and Call Me the Breeze spoke to these audiences with authenticity and respect. The band's live performances were electric and intense. Unlike the Allman Brothers' extended improvisations, Lynyrd Skynyrd's concerts were structured around song performances with solos that were substantial but contained within the song frameworks. The exception was Free Bird, which would typically close their shows and which featured an extended guitar section, the 3 guitars playing harmonized melodies and trading solos over a driving rhythm that built to a climactic finish. Free Bird became a ritual in Southern rock concerts, a song that audiences expected and demanded, raising lighters during the ballad opening and headbanging through the guitar finale. The song's theme of freedom and refusal to be tied down resonated with the independent spirit that Southern rock audiences valued, and its musical journey from acoustic intimacy to electric intensity mirrored the genre's range. Lynyrd Skynyrd's commercial breakthrough came with their 1973 debut album and accelerated through the mid-1970s as they toured relentlessly and built a devoted following. They played arenas and outdoor festivals, their 3-guitar attack and Van Zant's commanding stage presence making them one of the most popular live acts in American rock. They represented Southern rock at its most uncompromising and most commercially successful, proving that music with explicit regional identity could compete in the national market. Other bands emerged from Jacksonville and from across the South, each adding their own variations to the Southern rock sound. The Outlaws, based in Tampa, emphasized vocal harmonies and dual lead guitars, creating a sound that bridged Southern rock and country rock. Molly Hatchet, from Jacksonville, leaned toward heavier, more metal-influenced guitar work, while maintaining Southern rock's thematic concerns. Blackfoot combined hard rock power with blues and country elements. These bands, along with Lynyrd Skynyrd, represented the harder edge of Southern rock, the side of the genre that emphasized riffs and power and anthemic choruses over extended improvisation. This approach proved highly successful commercially, bringing Southern rock into the mainstream of 1970s rock music and establishing it as a significant force in American popular culture. The broader landscape, Marshall Tucker, Wet Willie, and Southern Soul. While the Allman Brothers and Lynyrd Skynyrd became the most visible representatives of Southern rock, numerous other bands contributed to the genre's diversity and development through the 1970s. The Marshall Tucker Band and Wet Willie, in particular, demonstrated that Southern rock could encompass a wide range of sounds and influences while maintaining its regional identity. The Marshall Tucker Band, formed in Spartanburg, South Carolina, in the early 1970s, brought a more country and jazz-influenced approach to Southern rock. Their lineup included flute and saxophone, alongside the standard rock instrumentation of guitars, bass, and drums, and their music incorporated elements of country, jazz, blues, and rock in fluid combinations that gave each song its own distinctive character. Toy Caldwell, the band's lead guitarist and primary songwriter, played with a melodic sensibility that drew from country and jazz as much as from blues. His guitar solos were lyrical and carefully constructed, more concerned with melody and phrasing than with raw power or extended improvisation. The presence of Jerry Eubanks on flute, saxophone, and keyboards added textures and colors that were unusual in rock music, giving the Marshall Tucker Band a sound that was immediately recognizable. Songs like Can't You See combined country-style storytelling with rock energy, the acoustic guitar and flute creating a gentler opening before electric guitars entered and pushed the song into full band territory. Heard It in a Love Song demonstrated the band's ability to craft melodic, accessible songs that maintained Southern rock's instrumental sophistication. Extended instrumental passages in songs like 24 Hours at a Time showed the band's jazz influences, with solos that explored harmonic changes rather than staying within blues-based structures. The Marshall Tucker Band's live performances were more structured than the Allman Brothers jams, but still allowed substantial room for improvisation and extended playing. Their concerts moved between quieter, more intimate moments, often featuring acoustic guitars and flute, and full band electric sections where all the instruments came together in powerful ensemble playing. This dynamic range made their shows varied and engaging, capable of appealing to audiences who wanted both musical sophistication and rock energy. Wet Willie, based in Mobile, Alabama, brought Southern soul and R&B more explicitly into the Southern rock framework. Their music incorporated horn sections, funk rhythms, and gospel-influenced vocals, creating a sound that was closer to the Muscle Shoals soul tradition than to blues rock. Singer Jimmy Hall's vocals and harmonica playing gave the band a distinctive front presence, his voice capable of both tender balladry and raw, shouted intensity. Keep on Smilin', Wet Willie's biggest hit, exemplified their approach. A horn-driven groove, gospel-style backing vocals, Hall's soulful lead singing, and guitar work that supported the song's feel without dominating it. The song worked equally well on AM radio and in live performance, demonstrating that Southern rock could be both commercially viable and musically distinctive. Wet Willie's connection to black musical traditions was more direct and acknowledged than some other Southern rock bands. They recorded at Muscle Shoals and worked with musicians who had deep roots in soul and R&B. Their sound reflected the reality that the musical landscape of the South was not divided into separate white and black traditions, but rather was a complex ecology where influences moved in all directions, where white musicians learned from black musicians and vice versa, where genres were porous and borrowing was constant. The Charlie Daniels Band represented yet another variation within Southern rock, one that leaned heavily into country and bluegrass traditions while maintaining rock energy and volume. Charlie Daniels himself was a veteran musician who had worked as a session player in Nashville and had played on Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline album. His fiddle playing drew from bluegrass and country traditions, and his songs often told stories in the narrative style of country music. The South's Gonna Do It Again, released in 1975, was both a celebration of Southern rock and a catalogue of the genre's major acts, name-checking the Allman Brothers, Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Marshall Tucker Band, and others. The song asserted Southern musical pride and positioned Southern rock as a coherent movement with shared identity and mutual support. Whether the "it" that the South was going to do again referred to musical dominance or to something more politically charged was deliberately ambiguous, allowing listeners to interpret the song according to their own understanding of Southern identity. The Devil Went Down to Georgia, released in 1979, became Charlie Daniels's biggest hit and one of the most recognizable Southern rock recordings. The song was structured as a narrative with fiddle pyrotechnics, representing the musical duel between the protagonist and the devil. Its bluegrass influences and storytelling approach connected Southern rock to older country traditions, while its electric instrumentation and rock energy kept it firmly within the Southern rock framework. These bands, along with many others, Grinder Switch, The Outlaws, Blackfoot, 38 Special, and more, created a rich and varied Southern rock landscape in the 1970s. The genre was not monolithic. It encompassed everything from extended blues jams to tight 3-minute singles, from acoustic balladry to heavy electric power, from country storytelling to soul and funk grooves. What unified these diverse approaches was a shared connection to the South as a place and an identity, a drawing upon Southern musical traditions, and a commitment to music that sounded distinctly regional even as it competed in national and international markets. The sound itself, guitars, organs, and the Southern rock aesthetic. To truly understand Southern rock, we must attend closely to the sound itself, to the specific instrumental approaches, production techniques, and musical gestures that defined the genre and distinguished it from other forms of rock music in the 1970s. The guitar was the central instrument, and the guitar sound of Southern rock had particular characteristics that were immediately recognizable. Southern rock guitarists favored Gibson guitars, Les Pauls and SGs particularly, and Marshall or Fender amplifiers, creating a tone that was warm and thick, with substantial mid-range presence and a natural overdrive that came from turning the amplifiers up to the point where they began to distort organically. The playing style emphasized blues-based phrasing. Guitarists used pentatonic scales and blues scales, bending strings to create vocal-like expressiveness, using vibrato to sustain and shape notes. The influence of B.B. King and Albert King and Freddie King, the three kings of electric blues, was evident in the way Southern rock guitarists approached melody and rhythm, treating the guitar as a singing instrument rather than merely a chordal or percussive one. Slide guitar became particularly associated with Southern rock, especially through Duane Allman's playing. The slide technique, using a glass or metal cylinder on one finger of the fretting hand to slide smoothly between notes rather than stopping the strings at discrete frets, allowed for perfect control of pitch and for the kind of swooping, singing tones that echoed both steel guitar traditions and vocal blues phrasing. Duane played slide in standard tuning rather than open tunings, which was unusual and which gave his playing a distinctive sound and approach. The twin guitar or triple guitar approach was another defining characteristic. Having 2 or 3 lead guitarists allowed for harmonized melodies, with guitars playing the same melodic line at different intervals, typically in thirds or sixths, creating a fuller, more complex sound than a single guitar could achieve. It also allowed for conversational interplay, with guitarists trading phrases, responding to each other, building musical dialogues within the structure of the song. This multi-guitar approach required careful arrangement and listening. The guitarists had to know when to play in unison, when to harmonize, when to play complementary rhythms, when to step back and let another guitar take the foreground. The best Southern rock bands achieved this balance intuitively, the guitarists listening closely to each other and to the whole ensemble, making musical decisions in real time that served the song and the performance. The Hammond B3 organ was the other signature instrument of Southern rock, particularly in the Allman Brothers sound. The Hammond organ produced a rich, complex tone through tone wheels and drawbars, and when played through a Leslie speaker, which used rotating baffles to create a swirling dimensional effect, it could fill enormous sonic space. Greg Allman's organ playing was both rhythmic and harmonic, providing chords and sustained tones that supported the guitars while also emerging into solos that had their own melodic and harmonic logic. The organ's role was to thicken the sound, to add layers of harmony and texture that guitars and bass alone couldn't provide. In quieter passages, the organ might play sustained chords that created an atmospheric backdrop. In louder sections, it might play rhythmic stabs that locked with the drums and pushed the music forward. In solo sections, it could take the melodic lead, playing long sustained notes or rapid runs across the keyboard. The rhythm section in Southern rock was crucial, even though it received less attention than guitars and organ. Southern rock drummers played with a strong backbeat, but also with a swing feel that came from blues and jazz traditions. The beat was solid and driving, but never mechanical. It breathed and flexed, responding to what the other instruments were doing, pushing slightly ahead or pulling slightly back to create tension and release. The use of 2 drummers, pioneered by the Allman Brothers, created a rhythmic complexity that was rare in rock music. The drummers could layer different patterns, with one playing a solid backbeat, while the other played more improvisational fills and accents. They could create polyrhythms, different rhythmic patterns happening simultaneously, that gave the music a depth and motion that a single drummer couldn't achieve. This required careful coordination and musical sensitivity, the drummers listening to each other and to the ensemble, knowing when to play in unison and when to diverge. The bass in Southern rock served primarily to lock with the drums and provide the harmonic foundation, but good Southern rock bassists also knew how to add melodic interest and rhythmic variation. They played with both fingers and picks, depending on the song's needs, and they understood how to support the music's dynamic range, playing more simply during busy sections and adding more melodic movement during sparser passages. The vocals in Southern rock carried distinct characteristics. Singers typically had rough, lived-in voices rather than smooth pop voices. They sang with Southern accents that were not hidden or smoothed away, but rather emphasized as part of the music's authenticity. The phrasing drew from blues and country traditions, the way notes were approached, the way syllables were stretched or compressed, the use of melisma and bending to add emotional color. The production aesthetic of Southern rock recordings was relatively straightforward and naturalistic compared to some 1970s rock. The recordings emphasized clarity and presence, capturing the sound of the instruments in the room rather than creating heavily processed or artificial sounds. The studios where Southern rock was typically recorded, Capricorn Studios in Macon, Criteria Studios in Miami, Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, used warm analog equipment and recording techniques that prioritized capturing good performances over extensive manipulation in mixing. Live recording techniques were particularly important because so much of Southern rock's identity was tied to live performance. The At Fillmore East album demonstrated that live recordings could be both commercially successful and artistically superior to studio recordings, capturing an energy and spontaneity that scripted studio sessions often missed. Many Southern rock albums included live tracks or were entirely live recordings, acknowledging that the genre's essence was more fully expressed in performance than in the controlled environment of the studio. The overall aesthetic was one of directness and authenticity. The music was meant to sound like a band playing together in real time, not like an assemblage of separately recorded parts. The imperfections, the slight variations in timing, the occasional rough edge in a vocal, the feedback that crept in during quiet moments, were not problems to be fixed, but rather evidence of the music's liveness and humanity. This aesthetic connected to the genre's cultural positioning. Southern rock was music for people who valued authenticity over polish, substance over surface, direct expression over artful presentation. It was music that took pride in sounding like it came from somewhere specific, made by people with dirt under their fingernails and sweat on their brows. People who worked hard and played hard and didn't apologize for being who they were. The live experience, concerts, festivals, and the Southern rock circuit. Southern rock was, fundamentally, a live music genre. While studio albums were important for establishing songs and reaching radio audiences, the true expression of the music happened in performance, in bars and arenas, in outdoor fields and college gymnasiums, in the direct encounter between bands and audiences. The live environment shaped everything about how Southern rock developed and what it meant to its audiences. A Southern rock concert was not simply a reproduction of recorded songs, but rather an event, a gathering, a shared experience that could transform familiar material into something new and unpredictable. The bands understood this and structured their performances accordingly, treating shows as opportunities for exploration and connection, rather than as scripted presentations. The smaller venues, the roadhouses and clubs where Southern rock bands often played early in their careers and sometimes continued to play even after achieving wider success, created an intimate and intense performance environment. These were spaces where the audience was close enough to see the musicians' fingers on their instruments, to see the sweat and the concentration and the communication between band members. The volume was loud because the amplifiers were close, and the sound was raw and immediate. In these settings, a concert might begin around 9 or 10 at night and continue until 1 or 2 in the morning. The band would play long sets with short breaks, building energy gradually, reading the crowd's response and adjusting their choices accordingly. If people were dancing and the energy was high, they might extend a particular groove or launch into an up-tempo song. If the room needed a breather, they might slow things down with a ballad or a quieter jam. The interaction between band and audience in these intimate venues was direct and continuous. The audience could shout requests or encouragement, and the band could respond either verbally or by incorporating what they were hearing into their musical choices. This created a feedback loop where the performance was shaped by both the band's intentions and the audience's energy, neither fully in control, the music emerging from their interaction. The larger venues, arenas and outdoor amphitheaters and festival grounds created different performance dynamics. The audiences were bigger, sometimes numbering in the thousands or tens of thousands, and the distance between stage and crowd was greater. But Southern rock bands adapted their approach to maintain connection and intensity even at this scale. The visual spectacle became more important in arena settings. Lighting rigs could create dramatic effects, colored spotlights washing across the stage, follow spots highlighting individual soloists, the stage going dark during quiet passages and then exploding with light during climaxes. The Marshall Tucker Band might use more subdued atmospheric lighting during their quieter, jazzier sections, while Lynyrd Skynyrd would employ aggressive rock concert lighting during their harder driving songs. The sound systems in larger venues had to be powerful enough to fill huge spaces while maintaining clarity and dynamic range. By the mid-1970s, touring sound reinforcement had developed to the point where it was possible to present reasonably accurate sound to large outdoor audiences, though the quality still varied considerably depending on venue acoustics and system quality. The best Southern rock concerts in arena or festival settings achieved a balance where the music was loud enough to be felt physically, but clear enough that individual instruments and vocals remained distinct. The outdoor festival was a particularly important context for Southern rock. These events, sometimes single-day affairs, sometimes multi-day gatherings, brought together multiple Southern rock bands, along with associated acts from country rock, blues, and mainstream rock. The festivals created temporary communities, audiences camping on site or traveling from nearby towns, spending entire days and nights in the festival environment. The outdoor setting changed the sensory experience of the music. The sound carried across open space, diffusing into the air rather than being contained by walls and ceiling. The visual experience was less controlled. Natural light during the day, darkness broken only by stage lights and campfires at night, stars visible overhead in rural locations far from city lights. The smells were different too: dust and grass, smoke from grills and campfires, the distinctive smell of outdoor crowds in summer heat. These festivals often took place in the south during warm months, which meant dealing with heat and humidity. Afternoon shows happened under brutal sun, with bands and audiences both enduring temperatures that could exceed 90 or even 100 degrees. Evening brought relief as temperatures dropped, but the humidity remained, creating a thick atmosphere where sound seemed to hang in the air, where movement through the crowd felt like moving through water. The ritual of these festivals became part of their appeal, arriving early to claim a good spot near the stage, wandering through the grounds between sets, encountering friends and strangers, eating food from vendor booths or from coolers brought from home, waiting through the long afternoon for the headlining bands to take the stage as darkness fell, hearing the first notes of a favorite song and feeling the crowd surge forward, thousands of people moving together in response to the music. The concerts themselves followed certain patterns while remaining unpredictable in their details. Opening acts would play shorter sets, establishing energy and warming up the audience. Mid-level acts might play an hour or 90 minutes, including a few extended songs, but generally moving through their material at a steady pace. Headliners would take the stage late, 10 or 11 at night often, and play for 2 or even 3 hours, stretching songs out, taking risks with improvisation, building to climactic moments that felt earned through the long build-up. The encore was a standard ritual by the 1970s, but in Southern rock it often felt more genuine than in some other genres. The audience's demand for more was real, born of not wanting the experience to end, and the band's return to the stage felt like a gift rather than an obligation. The encore songs were often the most beloved or the longest, Lynyrd Skynyrd ending with Free Bird, the Allman Brothers stretching Whipping Post to half an hour or more. The touring circuit that Southern rock bands travelled became its own geography, a map of the South defined by venues and colleges and festival sites. The University of Georgia in Athens, the University of Florida in Gainesville, Auburn, Tuscaloosa, Chapel Hill. These college towns had active music scenes and enthusiastic audiences. The Fox Theatre in Atlanta was a premier venue, its ornate interior creating a dramatic setting for concerts. Outdoor venues like the Great Southeast Music Hall in Atlanta or the large festival grounds that popped up in rural areas became pilgrimage sites for Southern rock fans. Bands would return to these venues repeatedly, sometimes playing the same town multiple times in a year. The audiences came to know what to expect and when to expect it. Certain songs would always be played, certain moments would always happen. But within this framework of familiarity, there was always the possibility of something new, an unexpected song, an extended jam that went to places it had never gone before, a night when everything clicked and the music transcended its usual bounds. This live-first culture meant that Southern rock bands spent much of their time on the road, traveling between gigs in vans and buses, sleeping in cheap motels or not sleeping, eating bad food, dealing with equipment breakdowns and cancelled shows and all the mundane difficulties of life on tour. The romanticism of the road was real for audiences who only saw the concerts, but for the musicians, it was also work, exhausting, sometimes tedious, occasionally dangerous work that required stamina and dedication. But the road also created bonds within bands and between bands and audiences. The shared experience of travel, the accumulation of stories and inside jokes, the development of musical communication through constant performance together. All of this created a sense of purpose and community that sustained musicians through the difficulties. And the direct connection with audiences, the immediate feedback of applause or dancing or rapt attention, provided validation that recording in a studio could never match. The studio world. Recording Southern rock. While live performance was the heart of Southern rock, the studio was where the music became fixed, where it was captured in forms that could be distributed widely, played on radio, sold in record stores, carried home by fans. The studio recording process for Southern rock had its own particular character, shaped by the genre's values and by the specific studios where much of the music was made. Capricorn Studios in Macon was the most important recording facility for Southern rock in the early 1970s. The studio was established by Phil Walden and Capricorn Records as a recording base for the label's artists, and it became the home studio for the Allman Brothers band and other Capricorn acts. The studio was equipped with professional-grade analog recording equipment, multi-track tape machines, mixing consoles, microphones, outboard effects, but it maintained a relaxed, informal atmosphere that encouraged creative risk-taking. The recording approach at Capricorn emphasized capturing live performances. Rather than recording instruments separately in isolation, the bands typically set up in the studio much as they would on stage and played together, with all the musicians in the same room or in connected rooms where they could see and hear each other. This approach preserved the ensemble feel and the interactive improvisation that was central to Southern rock's sound. Johnny Sandlin was the primary producer and engineer for many Capricorn recordings, and his aesthetic aligned with the music's values. He understood that the goal was not to create perfect, polished recordings, but rather to capture authentic performances, to preserve the energy and feel that made the music compelling in live settings. His production was relatively hands-off, focused on getting good sounds from the instruments and then letting the musicians play, trusting that good performances would emerge from the process. The recording process was not rushed. Bands might spend weeks or months working on an album, trying different arrangements, recording multiple takes of songs, listening back and deciding what was working. But the actual tracking, the process of recording the basic performances, was often done relatively quickly once the songs were ready, capturing the freshness and spontaneity that came from not over-rehearsing. Criteria Studios in Miami was another important Southern rock recording facility, particularly for some of the Allman Brothers' later work. Criteria was a larger, more commercial studio that had recorded everyone from James Brown to Eric Clapton, and it had a reputation for technical excellence. The studio's equipment and acoustics could deliver very clean, detailed recordings, though the challenge was always to maintain the rawness and energy of the music while taking advantage of the studio's capabilities. Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, while primarily known for soul and R&B recordings, also hosted Southern rock sessions. The studio's rhythm section, the session musicians known as the Swampers, had played on countless hits for black artists, and their understanding of groove and feel influenced the Southern rock musicians who recorded there. The Muscle Shoals aesthetic, warm, punchy, grounded in soul and blues traditions, aligned well with Southern rock's priorities. The recording techniques used in these studios were analog and relatively straightforward by later standards. The music was recorded to multi-track tape, typically 16-track or 24-track machines, with each instrument or group of instruments assigned to specific tracks. The drums might occupy 4 or 5 tracks: kick drum, snare, tom-toms, overhead microphones for cymbals. Bass would get its own track. Each guitar would get a track or two. Organ might be recorded in stereo, occupying 2 tracks. Vocals would have dedicated tracks. The recording was done in passes. The basic tracks, drums, bass, rhythm guitars, perhaps organ, would be recorded first, with the full band playing together to establish the song's foundation. Then additional parts would be overdubbed: lead guitar solos, vocal harmonies, additional percussion, whatever else the arrangement called for. Some bands overdubbed extensively, building up layers of guitars and voices. Others preferred to keep overdubs minimal, preserving the live-in-the-studio sound. The mixing process was where the recorded tracks were combined into a final stereo recording. The engineer would adjust the level of each track, deciding what should be loud and what should be quieter, panning instruments left and right to create a stereo image, adding reverb and other effects to create space and depth. The mix was a creative act, not just a technical one, and different mix decisions could dramatically change how a recording felt. Southern rock mixes tended to be relatively dry compared to some other rock genres, with less reverb and artificial space. The instruments were positioned clearly in the stereo field. Drums typically centered, guitars spread left and right, bass and vocals centered or near center, creating a sense that you were hearing the band in a room rather than in some artificially constructed sonic space. The final mastering process prepared the recording for vinyl pressing, adjusting overall levels and equalization to ensure the music would sound good when played back on record players. The limitations of vinyl, the way it handled bass frequencies, the way inner grooves had less high-frequency detail than outer grooves, had to be considered and compensated for. The relationship between studio recordings and live performances was complex and sometimes contradictory in Southern rock. The studio versions of songs were often shorter and more structured than the live versions, designed to fit on radio and to work within the time constraints of vinyl album sides. A song that might stretch to 15 minutes in concert would be condensed to 5 or 6 minutes on the album, with solos shortened and jam sections reduced or eliminated. This created a distinction between the album as a commercial object and the concert as a musical experience. The album introduced songs, established basic arrangements, demonstrated the band's capabilities in a controlled setting. But the concert was where the songs truly lived, where they could expand and breathe and become something more than their recorded versions. Some bands bridged this gap by releasing live albums that captured the extended performances and improvisational explorations that defined their concerts. The Allman Brothers at Fillmore East was the landmark example, but many Southern rock bands released live albums that became essential parts of their catalogue. These live recordings often outsold or were more valued than studio albums by devoted fans who preferred the music in its full, uncompromised form. The recording process itself could be shaped by Southern rock's live-first mentality. Some bands would essentially perform their songs in the studio, playing them straight through with minimal overdubbing, accepting imperfections if the overall performance had the right feel. This approach required musicians who could deliver strong performances without the safety net of extensive editing, but it resulted in recordings that captured the energy and spontaneity of live playing. Other bands took a more crafted approach, using the studio's possibilities to create arrangements and sounds that wouldn't be possible in live performance. Additional guitar tracks could create walls of harmonized sound. Keyboards could add atmospheric layers. Vocal harmonies could be stacked and refined. These studio enhancements didn't necessarily contradict Southern rock's aesthetic if they served the songs and maintained the music's essential character. The producer's role in these sessions varied. Some producers were hands-on, making significant creative contributions to arrangements and sounds. Others served primarily as facilitators, helping the band capture their own vision rather than imposing external ideas. The best producers understood the specific needs of each band and each project, knowing when to push and when to step back, when to suggest changes, and when to let things be. The studios themselves became part of Southern rock lore, talked about in album credits and interviews, visited by fans who wanted to see where their favorite albums had been made. The Big House in Macon, though not a recording studio, served as a rehearsal and gathering space, and stories from there became part of the mythology. These spaces were where the music was crafted, where ideas became recordings, where the performances that would be heard by millions were captured and preserved. Cultural identity, Southern rock, and the question of place. To understand Southern rock fully, we must grapple with what it meant as a cultural statement, how it functioned in relation to questions of Southern identity, race, class, and regional pride in the 1970s. This is complicated terrain, full of contradictions and contested meanings, but it is essential to the music's history and significance. Southern rock emerged at a particular moment in the South's history, the early 1970s, less than a decade after the major legislative victories of the civil rights movement, in a period when the region was still working out what these changes meant for social relations and cultural identity. The legal framework of Jim Crow segregation had been dismantled, but the social and economic patterns it had created and maintained persisted in many forms. For young white Southerners of the generation that created Southern rock, this was a formative context. They had grown up in a segregated South, but were coming of age in a moment when that system was being challenged and changed. They had absorbed both the region's white supremacist ideology and, for some, a growing awareness that this ideology was unjust and needed to be rejected. They had musical influences from both black and white traditions, and they were trying to figure out how to claim Southern identity in ways that acknowledged the region's culture while not defending its worst historical realities. Southern rock was one answer to this complex set of pressures. The music claimed Southernness loudly and proudly, asserting that being from the South was something to celebrate rather than to apologize for. But it did so through music that was deeply indebted to black musical traditions, the blues primarily, but also gospel and soul. This created a fundamental tension, celebrating Southern identity through music that had been created by the very people that the South's racial caste system had oppressed. Different bands navigated this tension in different ways. The Allman Brothers band, with J-Mo as an equal member rather than as a sideman or token, demonstrated racial integration in practice. They played music that wore its blues influences openly, and Duane Allman in particular spoke reverently about the black blues musicians he had learned from. The band's approach suggested that Southern identity could be reconstructed to honor all of the region's musical traditions and all of its people. Lynyrd Skynyrd's approach was more complicated. Their use of Confederate flag imagery and their defensive assertions of Southern pride could be read as racially coded, as resistance to the changes that civil rights had brought. But the band also collaborated with black musicians, and Ronnie Van Zant personally opposed racism even as he defended Southern culture. The contradiction was not resolvable into simple categories. The band occupied a conflicted position that reflected the contradictions of the South itself. The audiences for Southern rock were predominantly white, particularly in the genre's early years. This was partly a function of how the music industry and radio segregated audiences, with rock music marketed primarily to white listeners and soul and R&B marketed to black listeners, even though both traditions drew from shared musical roots. But it also reflected social realities. The concerts and festivals where Southern rock was played were spaces that were implicitly or explicitly white-coded, and black Southerners often did not feel welcome or safe in these spaces. This racial composition of audiences was significant because it meant that Southern rock became associated with white Southern identity specifically, even though the music's sound and sources were not exclusively white. The genre's symbols, the Confederate flag most problematically, but also references to rural life, trucks, working-class labor, carried racial implications whether or not individual musicians intended them to. The class dimension of Southern rock was as important as the racial dimension. The music spoke to and for working-class and lower-middle-class white Southerners, people who worked hard for modest pay, who were proud of their skills and their labor, who felt looked down upon by both Northern elites and Southern aristocrats. The long hair and denim of Southern rock style, the direct and sometimes crude language, the celebration of manual work and rural life, all of this aligned the genre with working-class identity. This class positioning connected to the genre's sound. The music was not polished or refined in the way that some progressive rock or art rock was. It was rough and direct, valuing feel over technical perfection, emotion over sophistication. The extended jams were not showpieces of virtuosity, though they required considerable skill, but rather communal explorations, the band working together to create something that couldn't be planned or scripted. The themes that appeared in Southern rock lyrics reinforced these class and regional identifications. Songs about highway travel reflected the mobility and restlessness of working people who might move from job to job, from town to town, following work or fleeing trouble. Songs about Saturday night drinking and fighting reflected the culture of roadhouses and bars where working people gathered for recreation. Songs about freedom and not being tied down reflected a resistance to the constraints of regular employment and social expectation. The gender dynamics of Southern rock were conventional for 1970s rock music, which is to say they were largely masculine and often excluded or objectified women. The bands were almost entirely male. The audiences included women, but were often majority male, particularly in the mosh and dance areas close to the stage. The imagery was of male camaraderie, of brotherhood, of freedom defined as escape from domestic responsibility. Women appeared in lyrics primarily as lovers or as objects of desire, rarely as full subjects with their own agency and experience. This masculine orientation was not unique to Southern rock. It characterized much of rock music in the 1970s, but it was particularly pronounced in a genre that was already defined by working-class identity and regional pride, both of which were coded as masculine virtues. The long hair that Southern rock musicians wore was a marker of rebellion, but it was masculine rebellion, aligned with biker culture and outlaw imagery, rather than with the more androgynous aesthetics of some other rock subcultures. The relationship between Southern rock and country music was also significant for understanding the genre's cultural positioning. Country music was the other major musical genre associated with the White South, and there was substantial overlap in audiences and themes between Southern rock and country. But Southern rock was louder, more electric, more aligned with youth culture and rebellion. Country music in the 1970s was often more conservative, more explicitly tied to traditional values and lifestyles. Southern rock borrowed from country, the storytelling, the honky-tonk piano, sometimes the pedal steel guitar, but it electrified and intensified these elements, making them louder and harder and more suited to the arena and festival contexts where rock concerts happened. This allowed Southern rock to appeal to audiences who wanted music that sounded Southern, but who didn't want the more traditional or conservative associations of country music. The Northern reception of Southern rock was mixed. Some listeners and critics appreciated the music's energy and musicianship, while remaining uncomfortable with its regional symbolism and its racial and class associations. The Confederate flag imagery in particular troubled many Northern observers who saw it primarily as a symbol of slavery and racism rather than as a more ambiguous marker of regional identity. Southern rock bands were aware of these perceptions and sometimes pushed back against them. They argued that Southernness was more complex than Northern stereotypes allowed, that the South included people of different political views and racial attitudes, that being proud of Southern culture didn't mean defending everything the South had done. But these arguments were complicated by the genre's actual symbolism and by the fact that some fans clearly did interpret Southern rock in terms that were racially conservative or reactionary. By the late 1970s, as Southern rock achieved mainstream commercial success, some of these cultural and political tensions began to ease. The music became accepted as a legitimate regional variation of American rock, something that could be appreciated for its musical qualities without necessarily engaging with its more complicated cultural dimensions. This mainstreaming both expanded Southern rock's audience and arguably diluted some of its regional specificity and edge. The road and the highway, travel as theme and experience. The highway runs through Southern rock, both literally and metaphorically, as an actual experience that shaped the music and as a recurring theme in lyrics and imagery. Understanding the role of travel and the road in Southern rock means understanding both the practical realities of touring and the symbolic meanings that roads and travel carried in American culture. The practical reality was that Southern rock bands traveled constantly. Touring was essential to building an audience in the era before music video and widespread FM radio play. Bands had to go to where the audiences were, playing shows in town after town, gradually building reputations through live performance. This meant spending vast amounts of time in vehicles, vans in the early years, buses and trucks as bands became more successful, moving between gigs that might be hundreds of miles apart. The geography of these tours was primarily Southern in the early years, following circuits through the region's colleges and clubs and venues. A typical run might move from Macon to Jacksonville, to Gainesville, to Tuscaloosa, to Birmingham, to Atlanta, and back to Macon, hitting college towns and mid-sized cities, playing to audiences that were increasingly familiar with the bands and the music. As Southern rock became more nationally known, the tours expanded to include the rest of the country, but the Southern circuit remained the home base and the core audience. The highways themselves were two-lane roads through rural areas for much of this circuit, passing through small towns and pine forests, crossing rivers and cutting through red clay hills. The interstate highway system was still being completed in the South in the 1970s, and many routes still followed older highways that wound through the landscape rather than cutting straight across it. This meant that highway travel was slower and more immersive in the landscape, a journey through places rather than a rapid transit between destinations. The experience of this travel was both mundane and transformative. Much of it was tedious. Hours of sitting, looking out windows at passing scenery, dealing with the discomfort of van or bus seating, the boredom of long stretches with nothing to do. But it also created time for conversation, for musical discussion and planning, for the kind of idle thinking that can lead to creative ideas, and it created an intimacy among band members, a shared experience of the road that bonded them together. The stops along the way became part of the routine and the mythology. Gas stations where the van would fuel up and the band would buy snacks and use restrooms. Diners where they would eat late-night meals, often the only customers at 3 a.m, ordering eggs and bacon and coffee while the waitress wondered who these long-haired men were. Motels where they would catch a few hours of sleep before driving to the next town and the next gig. These experiences of road life fed directly into the music's themes. Songs about traveling, about being on the move, about the freedom and the weariness of constant motion. These were not abstract compositions, but rather expressions of lived experience. When Greg Allman sang Midnight Rider about being on the run and having to keep moving, the song carried the weight of actual nights spent driving through darkness towards some distant destination. The highway also functioned symbolically as a space of freedom and possibility. In American culture generally, and in Southern culture particularly, the open road represented escape from constraint, the possibility of reinvention, the freedom to keep moving rather than being tied down to one place or one identity. This theme had deep roots in American mythology, the frontier, the cowboy, the drifter, and it resonated with audiences who felt trapped by circumstances or who valued independence over stability. For Southern audiences, the highway theme had additional resonances. The South was a region that many people left, moving north or west in search of better economic opportunities or to escape social constraints. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities was the most massive expression of this, but white Southerners also left in significant numbers, following similar routes and motivations. The highway represented both the possibility of leaving and the pull of return, the tension between staying and going that characterized much Southern experience. Southern rock's highway songs often expressed ambivalence about movement. The freedom of the road was real, but so was the loneliness, the loss of connection, the weariness of never settling. Songs celebrated the independence of the traveling life, while also acknowledging its costs. This ambivalence felt authentic to audiences who understood that freedom and belonging were often in tension, that you couldn't easily have both at once. The vehicles themselves became part of the imagery. Pickup trucks, which were practical work vehicles in the rural South, became symbols of Southern identity and blue-collar pride. Lynyrd Skynyrd arriving at concerts in pickup trucks rather than limousines was a statement about class identity and authenticity. Fans arriving at concerts in their own trucks reinforced this identification. The parking lots of Southern rock shows becoming fields of domestic vehicles rather than the foreign sports cars that might park outside other kinds of rock concerts. The tour bus, which became the standard transportation for successful rock bands, was a different kind of space, a mobile home where musicians could sleep and socialize and work while covering vast distances. The bus created a bubble, a moving private space where the external world was visible through windows but kept at a distance. This separation was both a privilege and an isolation, allowing bands to maintain continuity while constantly moving, but also cutting them off from sustained contact with places and people outside their immediate circle. The accidents that sometimes happened on these highways became part of Southern rock's tragic history. Dwayne Allman died in a motorcycle accident in Macon. Berry Oakley, the Allman Brothers bassist, died in a motorcycle accident almost exactly a year later, just a few blocks from where Dwayne had died. The Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, though not a highway accident, shared the road's dangers, the risk that came with constant travel, the fragility of life lived in motion. These deaths reinforced the association between Southern rock and the road, but in darker terms. The freedom and possibility of movement came with real dangers. The road that offered escape could also lead to destruction. This memento mori element became part of the music's emotional landscape, an acknowledgement that the life being celebrated was also a life at risk, that the freedom being claimed came at a price. The late-night character of much highway travel, bands driving through darkness to reach the next town by morning, connected to Southern rock's overall aesthetic. The music itself often evoked nighttime, with its blues roots and its association with bars and late-night gatherings. The highways at night had a particular quality, the darkness pressing close beyond the headlights' reach, the occasional lights of a distant town or a passing truck, the way radio signals would fade in and out as you moved through different broadcast ranges. This nocturnal highway experience became part of how audiences listened to the music. Southern rock playing on a car radio late at night, the highway stretching ahead, the landscape invisible in darkness. This was one of the genre's natural habitats, a context where the music made perfect sense, where it sounded exactly right. The music was built for these moments, its extended jams filling the time and miles, its themes of travel and freedom resonating with the actual experience of being in motion through the southern night. Turning points, tragedy and transformation in the late 1970s. The late 1970s brought both triumph and tragedy to Southern rock, with the genre reaching its commercial peak, even as major disasters struck its most important bands. These turning points, particularly the deaths of key musicians and the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, marked the end of Southern rock's first era and shaped how the music would be remembered and how it would evolve afterward. Dwayne Allman's death in October 1971 was the first major loss. He died in a motorcycle accident in Macon at age 24, at a moment when the Allman Brothers band was ascending to national prominence on the strength of At Fillmore East. His death was shocking not only because of his youth and talent, but because it happened in such a sudden and mundane way. A collision with a truck, an injury that proved fatal despite medical intervention. The band's decision to continue after Dwayne's death was not inevitable. They could have disbanded, acknowledging that Duane's contribution was irreplaceable. But they chose to go on, completing the album they had been working on, and eventually recruiting additional musicians to fill out the sound that Duane had anchored. The music they made after his death was different, less centered on the dual guitar interplay that had defined their early work, more focused on Dickie Betts's compositional contributions and on Greg Allman's organ and vocals. Berry Oakley's death almost exactly a year later, also in a motorcycle accident in Macon, was a cruel echo of Duane's loss. Oakley had been Duane's closest musical partner in the band, his bass playing providing the harmonic and rhythmic foundation for the guitar's explorations. His death suggested a cursed quality to the band's story, a sense that the intensity they brought to their music carried over into a recklessness in their lives. The Allman Brothers continued after Oakley's death too, but the losses had fundamentally altered the band. They remained popular and continued to make successful music through the mid-1970s, but the chemistry and the sense of destiny that had characterized their early years was gone. They became a very good band rather than a transcendent one, capable of professional performances, but less likely to achieve the moments of collective improvisation that had made them extraordinary. The Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash on October 20th, 1977, was a catastrophe of a different magnitude. The band was at the peak of their commercial success, touring to support their album Street Survivors, when their chartered plane ran out of fuel and crashed in a Mississippi swamp. Ronnie Van Zant, the band's singer and primary songwriter, was killed, along with guitarist Steve Gaines and backup singer Cassie Gaines. Other band members and crew were seriously injured. The crash was a senseless accident caused by pilot error and mechanical failure, preventable in hindsight but devastating in its consequences. The crash essentially ended Lynyrd Skynyrd as an active band. The surviving members were physically and emotionally devastated, and they decided not to continue under the Lynyrd Skynyrd name. Van Zant's death was particularly significant because he had been the band's primary voice and lyrical sensibility, the person who articulated their vision of Southern rock in its hardest and most commercially successful form. The crash also became a kind of symbolic end point for Southern rock's first era. Lynyrd Skynyrd had been the genre's most successful band in commercial terms, and their sudden absence left a vacuum that other bands couldn't fully fill. The tragedy gave the music a memorial quality, a sense that its peak moment had passed, and that what came after would necessarily be different and diminished. These deaths were not the only challenges Southern rock faced in the late 1970s. The musical landscape was changing, with punk rock emerging as a reaction against the kind of extended, virtuosic rock that Southern rock represented. Disco was dominating commercial radio and popular culture, occupying the space that rock music had held earlier in the decade. The industry was consolidating, with major labels absorbing or shutting down independent labels like Capricorn. Capricorn Records itself went bankrupt in 1979, closing the studio and the infrastructure that had been central to Southern rock's development. The label's collapse had multiple causes: financial mismanagement, changing market conditions, the loss of its most important artists, but it marked the end of the Macon-centered Southern rock scene as an organized entity. Some Southern rock bands adapted to the changing environment by moving toward harder, more arena-oriented sounds. Molly Hatchet and 38 Special both emerging in the late 1970s, played a version of Southern rock that was closer to mainstream hard rock, with less emphasis on improvisation and blues feel, and more emphasis on power chords and anthemic choruses. This approach was commercially successful and kept Southern rock viable in the album-oriented rock radio format, but it was also less distinctive, less clearly rooted in specifically Southern musical traditions. The Charlie Daniels Band found success by leaning into country rock and eventually into country music itself, with The Devil Went Down to Georgia becoming a crossover hit that worked on both rock and country radio. This demonstrated that Southern rock's musical elements could be recombined and repositioned for different markets, that the genre's boundaries were porous and flexible. But the sense of Southern rock as a cohesive movement, as a distinct genre with its own identity and scene, began to fade in the early 1980s. The bands that had defined the genre's first era were dead, dissolved, or transformed. New bands were not emerging with the same regional focus or the same connection to Southern rock's original musical and cultural sources. The music became diffused into the broader landscape of American rock, influential, but no longer distinct. The legacy, however, persisted. The albums that had been recorded in Southern rock's peak years, at Fillmore East, Lynyrd Skynyrd's Pronounced and Second Helping, the Marshall Tucker Band's early work, remained in print and continued to find new listeners. Classic rock radio, which became a major format in the 1980s, played Southern rock alongside other 1970s rock, introducing the music to audiences who hadn't experienced it in its original context. The live concert tradition also continued, with surviving bands touring regularly and new configurations forming. The Allman Brothers Band would reunite in various forms, sometimes achieving the improvisational heights of their early years. Lynyrd Skynyrd's name would eventually be revived by surviving members and by Ronnie Van Zant's brother Johnny, playing the classic material for audiences who wanted to hear it performed live. These later versions were explicitly nostalgic, recreating the past rather than creating something new, but they served a real need for audiences who valued the music and wanted to experience it in live settings. The legacy, Southern rock's lasting influence. As the 1970s ended and Southern rock's first era concluded, the music left a legacy that would influence American rock and popular culture for decades to come. This influence operated at multiple levels: musical, cultural, regional, and it shaped how later generations of musicians understood the relationship between rock music and place, between musical tradition and innovation. Musically, Southern rock demonstrated that regional musical traditions could be incorporated into rock music in ways that were both authentic to their sources and viable in contemporary commercial contexts. The blues-based improvisation, the gospel-influenced organ, the country storytelling, the slide guitar techniques, all of these elements came from specific Southern musical practices, and Southern rock showed that they could be amplified and electrified and performed for rock audiences without losing their essential character. This had implications for other regional rock movements. The success of Southern rock made it possible for bands from other regions to claim their own local traditions and identities as sources for rock music. Heartland rock in the Midwest, cowpunk in the Southwest, various regional scenes across the country. All of these were enabled in part by Southern rock's demonstration that rock music didn't have to be either British or generically American, that it could be specifically and proudly regional. The jam band tradition that emerged in the 1980s and flourished in the 1990s and 2000s owed a significant debt to Southern rock, particularly to the Allman Brothers' approach to extended improvisation. Bands like Widespread Panic, Gov't Mule, and the Derek Trucks Band were directly influenced by the Allman Brothers and consciously carried forward the tradition of blues-based extended jams. The jam band scene's emphasis on live performance over studio recordings, its touring culture, its communal relationship with audiences, all of this echoed Southern rock's values and practices. Country rock and alternative country also drew from Southern rock's synthesis of country and rock elements. The twang and the storytelling and the honky-tonk piano that Southern rock had incorporated from country traditions influenced later artists who were working at the intersection of these genres. Drive-By Truckers, an alternative country band from Alabama, explicitly positioned themselves as inheritors of Southern rock's cultural project, addressing Southern identity and history through music that combined rock energy with country and soul influences. Southern rock's influence on mainstream rock was more diffuse but still significant. The guitar harmonies that became common in arena rock and heavy metal owed something to the twin guitar approach of the Allman Brothers and Lynyrd Skynyrd. The emphasis on live performance and on treating songs as frameworks for extended solos influenced how many rock bands structured their concerts. The idea that rock music could be virtuosic and improvisational, while remaining accessible to mass audiences, was reinforced by Southern rock's example. Culturally, Southern rock's impact was complex and contested. For some Southerners, particularly white working-class Southerners, the music remained a source of regional pride and identity, a demonstration that the South could produce culture that was valued nationally and internationally. The Confederate flag controversy that Southern rock had both participated in and been affected by continued to be debated, with changing understandings of the flag's meaning leading some bands and fans to reconsider its use. The racial dynamics of Southern rock's legacy were also complex. The genre had drawn heavily from black musical traditions, while being primarily performed by white musicians for primarily white audiences. Later musicians and scholars grappled with this tension, trying to understand both the genuine musical exchange that had happened and the ways that white musicians had been able to profit from black musical innovations, while black musicians themselves often faced barriers to similar success. Some later Southern rock-influenced bands were more conscious about acknowledging and honoring the black musical traditions they drew from. The integration that the Allman Brothers had practiced became more common in jam bands and Southern rock revivals, with black and white musicians playing together and explicit acknowledgement of the African American roots of blues and gospel traditions. The regional identity that Southern rock had articulated, proud but complicated, rooted in tradition but not uncritically defensive of the past, influenced how later generations of Southerners thought about what it meant to be Southern. The music had shown that it was possible to love the South's landscape and culture and musical traditions, while also recognizing the region's difficult history and working toward a more inclusive future. The venues and festivals that had been central to Southern rock's development continued to operate, hosting later generations of Southern rock-influenced bands. The club circuit through Southern college towns remained active. Outdoor festivals continued to draw crowds for multi-day celebrations of Southern music. The infrastructure that Southern rock had helped build persisted and served new music and new audiences. The recordings themselves became classic rock staples, played on radio stations that programmed 1970s rock and heard by new generations of listeners who discovered them through their parents' record collections or through streaming services. At Fillmore East and pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd and the other landmark albums remained reference points, demonstrating what Southern rock had achieved at its peak and providing templates for what the music could be. The tragic deaths that had marked Southern rock's history also contributed to its legacy, giving the music a poignant quality, a sense of potential cut short, of greatness glimpsed but not fully realized. Duane Allman's slide guitar, heard on recordings made before his death at 24, became a standard against which later guitarists measured themselves. Ronnie Van Zant's lyrics about Southern life and freedom, silenced at age 29, remained as articulations of a particular moment and place and identity. By the early 21st century, Southern rock had achieved a kind of historical stability. It was recognized as an important genre in American music history, taught in music courses, written about in scholarly studies, preserved in museums and archives. The debates about its meaning and its relationship to Southern identity and racial politics continued, reflecting ongoing conversations about the South and its place in American culture. But the music itself, when heard without the weight of all these contexts and debates, retained its power. The guitars still sang with blues feeling, the drums still swung with authority, the vocals still expressed longing and pride, and the particular emotional grain of the South. The extended jams still created spaces for collective exploration and individual expression. The music remained alive in a way that transcended its historical moment, speaking to anyone who valued blues feeling, virtuosic playing, and the honest expression of lived experience. The Highway at Dawn, still playing through the FM frequencies, and the music that comes through, perhaps for the last time tonight before the morning shows take over, is Southern rock. A long instrumental passage, guitars trading phrases, the rhythm section driving forward with steady authority, the whole performance building toward some resolution that feels earned through the journey that preceded it. We have traced Southern rock through its history, from its roots in the blues to its evolution into a genre that has influenced countless other artists. We have traced Southern rock through its origins and its development, through its peak and its tragedies, through its recording studios and its concert venues, through its musical innovations and its cultural meanings. The music that emerged from the American South in the 1970s was more than just a regional variation of rock and roll. It was a cultural formation that expressed something specific about the South in a moment of transition and transformation. It drew on deep musical traditions, blues and gospel and country, and combined them in ways that were both respectful of their sources and innovative in their application. It created a sound that was immediately recognizable as Southern, that carried the accent and the phrasing and the emotional texture of the region. The musicians who created Southern rock were mostly young white Southerners, trying to figure out what it meant to be Southern at a time when the region's identity was being contested and renegotiated. They were influenced by Black musical traditions that they had grown up hearing and that they genuinely loved and respected, even as they were also benefiting from racial privileges that gave them opportunities that Black musicians often didn't have. They were proud of being Southern, while also in many cases rejecting the racism and segregation that had characterized the region's recent past. The music they made reflected these tensions and complexities. It was blues-based but electric and amplified. It was improvisational but structured. It was regional but cosmopolitan. It spoke to working-class audiences while also appealing to college students and progressive rock fans. It used symbols that were fraught with historical meaning, the Confederate flag most problematically, while also trying to articulate a Southern identity that could be inclusive and forward-looking. The live performance culture that Southern rock created, the extended jams, the communal energy between bands and audiences, the touring circuits through Southern venues, was central to the music's meaning and impact. This was music that truly lived in performance, that used studio recordings as documentation rather than as the primary artistic statement. The concerts were where Southern rock happened most fully, where the music could extend and breathe and become something more than its recorded versions. The studios where Southern rock was recorded, Capricorn in Macon, Criteria in Miami, Muscle Shoals in Alabama, were important not just as technical facilities, but as cultural spaces where the music was crafted and refined. The producers and engineers who worked in these studios understood what Southern rock needed sonically: warmth and clarity, space for the instruments to be heard individually and as an ensemble, a balance between polish and rawness that preserved the music's essential character. The tragic deaths that marked Southern rock's history, Duane Allman, Berry Oakley, the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, gave the music a memorial quality, a sense of potential unfulfilled, of great artists taken too soon. These losses shaped how the music would be remembered, adding poignancy and weight to recordings that documented what these musicians had achieved before their deaths. The legacy of Southern rock extended far beyond the 1970s, influencing subsequent generations of musicians and shaping how Americans understood the relationship between rock music and regional identity. The jam band tradition, heartland rock, alternative country, and numerous other movements drew from Southern rock's example, incorporating its musical approaches, or its cultural stance, or its emphasis on live performance. But perhaps more important than any specific influence was what Southern rock demonstrated about the possibilities of regional music in a mass-mediated culture. The genre showed that music could be deeply rooted in a specific place and its traditions while also speaking to broader audiences, that regional identity could be a source of artistic strength rather than a limitation, that local musical practices could be honored and preserved even as they were adapted to contemporary contexts. The highway ahead begins to show color as the sun rises behind us, the landscape emerging from darkness into the soft light of early morning. The pine trees are green again, not just dark shapes. The red clay of the roadside is visible. A town appears ahead, its buildings catching the first direct sunlight. The radio station fades as we move out of its range, static growing, the music becoming intermittent. But the music itself doesn't fade, even as this particular broadcast ends. It remains in memory, in the recordings that captured it, in the influence it had on everything that came after. Southern rock in the 1970s was a particular phenomenon, rooted in a specific time and place, created by specific people under specific circumstances. But the music they made transcended those specifics, speaking to anyone who has felt the pull of place and tradition, anyone who has experienced the freedom and the weariness of the road, anyone who has heard in the bend of a guitar string or the swing of a rhythm section something that feels like truth. The highway continues, the music continues, and the story continues in everyone who hears these recordings and finds in them something that resonates, something that speaks to their own experience, or that opens a window into someone else's. This is what music does when it works, when it connects. It creates bridges across time and distance, between the people who made it and the people who hear it, between the specific and the universal, between what was and what continues to be. The sun is fully up now, the night is over. But the music remains, patient and ready, waiting for the next time someone tunes in a radio, or drops a needle on a record, or calls up a streaming file, waiting to sound again across the darkness or the light, across the highways and the distance, carrying with it the heat and the humidity and the particular feeling of the American South in the 1970s, when young musicians plugged in their guitars and played the blues with rock and roll energy and called it something new, Southern rock.